All right, welcome back. So we are here with day 2's speakers. I feel like we're on a talk show or something with all of our contestants who gave wonderful talks today. Thank you, buzz in. We might have a buzz in section.
We've got a lively crowd.
But we are gonna actually start this panel session with a question from Dr. Nicola Rooney. And she was just joining us from the UK. It was at 2 a.m. her time, but she pulled through. She even brought her dog into the conversation. It was wonderful. So her question was, let's say you are posed with the question of creating an action plan to improve dog welfare. What would you do? Go for it. Don't buzz in all at once.
And Jim, it's probably fair to say maybe we'll start with you, Jim, because the question came from your list of priorities, and Nicola felt that perhaps it had been overlooked as a priority.
So is this on? Do I need to?
It doesn't sound on.
Doesn't
It
sound
might not be on.
Give it a moment. Check if it is on.
Testing. Check. Hello.
Maybe try the other mic.
It says on.
It might not be on.
Make sure it's on.
Testing. Hello.
Is there a green light? Oh.
One moment. We'll just have a little interlude.
I can go find out.
Testing. 1, 2.
Okay, great.
I'm going to keep the one that
For a
works.
minute, I thought we were going to have to talk about my dog.
Okay, I absolutely agree. As she was making the comment, I was in the audience, and I agree. I think it was missing. So I didn't say I didn't guarantee it was 100%. So I agree with her completely. I think it is missing. My thought as I was sitting there was that I was thinking somewhat more about some of the basic science, which then leads to, being able to apply it to welfare situations. But there are some basic questions about welfare, I think, too. So my first thought was absolutely yes. That's another gap, and it should be on the list, and so on. So I have no problem with that. I think that was a good point. From what about welfare should be on the list is I think what she was asking about, the action plan and how would you move forward on that, and I'm not sure I have as good a result, an answer to that. So I was going to throw it down to somebody like Steve or Kathryn or anybody else who has an opinion about that. But I certainly agree that it should be on the list. It is a gap.
Great. We can go down.
I would just say that I think all the things that Jim had on the list could then be applied to welfare. So even stuff that seems sort of far afield, like the evolution stuff, if we understand how dogs survive when they're not in our homes, it could help us improve welfare when they are or in kennels. Development obviously could be applied. Genetics even could be applied. I think all the information we would get and fill in those gaps would allow us to then improve welfare.
Steve?
Okay. Welfare has kept my kettle full for the past quarter century. So I think one of the things to do is take a look at it both in terms of short-term and long-term elements. I think there are some short-term things that we can look at, and perhaps the 5 freedoms, much the same as we did with farm animal welfare, provides a framework and how we can apply those. And I think we also need to look at then the various places where we see dogs. I mean, is it dogs in shelters? Is it dogs in homes? Is it dogs that are in work situations? And that may require somewhat different elements. But I think we can probably fairly rapidly see some ways to improve that because we know that there are places that do a better job than other places. So it's not a question that we need to figure some of that out. We know that some shelters are better than others. Some places that do working dogs do a better job than others. And we just need to ensure that we can define those best practices as we see them and then apply them. The longer term question, I think, is some of the stuff, and I think Nicola was involved with this, and I've been involved in some workshops on this. It came out of the BBC documentary, Purebred Dogs Exposed. I think there's a long-term question of we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing to dogs when we're breeding them? I think some of the information that Hal showed, it's an absolute travesty that we're still breeding bulldogs. And I used to get into arguments with Roger Karras when he was president, and I used to say, look, if a dog can't self-whelp, I mean, I don't understand why they're being bred in the first place. And so I think, we need to look at some of those questions. Wayne Kavanaugh, a friend of mine who's been president of the United Kennel Club, has a spectacular presentation where he's able to show how a winning bulldog from the 1940s compared to a winning bulldog in 2014, they're fundamentally different dogs, because what's happened is they've taken that AKC standard and they've applied it to an extreme that is ridiculous. Basset hounds are another great example. I mean, it's hard to believe. These are dogs that were field dogs. They're supposed to be able to go out and follow a hare. I mean, your average basset hound looks like you'd have a hard time getting up the steps in your home. And so, that's a question. That's a long-term question. It's really going to take a lot of cultural changes in terms of how we're breeding those dogs.
Al, do you have anything you'd like to contribute in regards to
I was actually going to say sort of the same thing that Steve said, but it seems to me that the quest for perfection on the AKC confirmation trials is a doomed effort, because basically what you're doing is you're breeding something that I compared to the modern tomato, which is something that absolutely looks perfect. But once you look under the hood, it's really broken. And so I think there needs to be about this idea that dogs have become a fashion statement has not been good for dogs. And so what we've done to some of these breeds is unreversible. The King Charles Cavalier Spaniel, which has a head which Oshfriend would liken to a kid with hydrocephalus, because of the brain being squeezed, live in constant pain. We did that because of this quest for perfection. I think that's going to require a major shift in thinking.
Yeah, and an interesting thing is this weekend, and I think Kalamazoo, Michigan, the United Kennel Club is holding this massive event that they do for dogs. And I think they've made kind of an interesting step in a direction, and that is, you can't put a dog into a conformation show unless it's competing in some type of activity event. It can be agility, it can be obedience, it can be dock diving, any number of different things, but really wanting to move back to a point where the dogs actually did stuff. They have to be physically capable of doing something. One of the most interesting quotes I heard recently, which I thought was somewhat ironic with Westminster. A couple of years ago, a peak one, Westminster, the dog was so physically compromised it had to sit on an ice pack when it was doing its interviews. Alternatively, this past year, when a beagle won again, nature's most perfect dog, but one of the things that the judge said, he said when he watched that dog move across the floor of Madison Square Garden, he said, I could picture that dog in the field on trial with a hare or a rabbit. And, maybe that's what we've forgotten when we've, you watch a German Shepherd move across the ring and you say, dang, that's a dog that's supposed to be able to run down a convict? I don't think so. And so I think that's really one of the steps in terms of the welfare is we pride ourselves that we've created dogs to do different jobs, and then we sort of forgot the jobs and we don't let them do them anymore, and we don't breed them to do them.
Any other thoughts from the panel? Well, this does actually tie into a question that was posed from an audience member, essentially saying, who decides what are the welfare standards? We brought up the 5 freedoms, but you've also got rescue groups that are pulling dogs out of a particular environment, very often what they might consider an impoverished environment, and bringing them into another environment. And they were interested in the panel's take on what is the dog's natural environment? Where should we keep them? What welfare standards should we apply to different environments? Thank you, Kathryn.
Jump in. So I think one thing we have to keep in mind is that the developmental environment has a really big play here. If you have an animal that is developed its early life in a kennel, then that's probably where it will be most comfortable, strangely enough, where if it developed its early life out free living, that's probably where it will be most comfortable. If it's been a pet, that's probably where it will be most comfortable. And then, of course, within that, we have to determine beyond that what would be good welfare. But I think sometimes it's easy to say, oh, it's a kennel, it's bad. But if we take a dog who's lived its whole life in a kennel and throw it in a home, it's going to be terrified, and that wouldn't be good welfare for that dog. But if you have a dog who's lived its whole life in the home and you throw it in a kennel, you get the same effect. So I just think that welfare for one dog is not necessarily the same for another.
There has to be more. No? Thank you.
Okay, that's fine. We've got plenty.
There are some guidelines. I mean, there are some guidelines, I think, that can be followed. Some models, I guess, as Steve put it earlier. Some models that can be followed for this, because there are a number of species that do fall under federal protection in captivity, research subjects and things like that. And so I come from a background where I have worked as consulting for behavioral welfare for non-human primates, and there are very tight guidelines, and they're not perfect, but they're very tight definitions about welfare and about stress and about what's allowed and what's a space requirement and things like that. And I frequently, having worked in that environment, and have gone into, for instance, shelters, who shall be unnamed and so on, and said, if I was doing research and under the control of federal government rules, state rules, institutional animal care rules, and all the rules that we have for research, I'd never be able to house a research animal the way these dogs are being housed. But they're dogs, and so they are not under the same kind of rules, and so on. And so there are models for, they're never perfect, and they should be always evolving, but with society. But there are some models for some of those kind of things that could be established, at least as a starting point. But certainly, I'll still come back to the fact that we need to know a lot more about dogs. We know a lot more about the welfare and the psychological well-being and factors and so on in non-human primates than we ever do, certainly in dogs. So we need the information first, and then there are models for some of those kinds of things.
Márta.
There are just one comment that I believe that researchers should provide a little bit more empirical data, research on this field, and they should help a little bit more the applied experts, because sometimes it's really difficult to decide. Everybody wants really to help these dogs, and there are different opinions and the different experiences. So we would need a little bit more data on what's really efficient. For example, just I'm more experienced in the attachment field. So yeah, we know already for 15 years that dogs are able to develop new attachment bond very, very quickly with a person who handles them just on a few sessions. And the question, what I always face, and it's very difficult to answer, is that, okay, then in shelters, should we handle these dogs? Should we let the dog walkers handle them intensely? What about building up new relationships, and we must break these? And is it really good for our dogs? Because we want to help, but maybe we would do something wrong. And there's no data. We cannot, at the moment, we cannot answer these questions. So we would need really much more research on this field.
Okay. Kathryn, did you have something you wanted to add as well?
I just wanted to mention that there are laboratory standards for keeping dogs as well. It's just in case that wasn't clear. But I think they're lacking, but they do exist. And I have run into exactly the problem you're talking about, where I wanted to do research on kennel enrichment in a shelter, and I had trouble with the IACUC, which is the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee that approves welfare for laboratory things, or any experiment really. If you want to do an experiment on the animal, you have to go through them. It's part of the Animal Welfare Act. And the problem was that it wasn't up to laboratory standards. Of course, I was trying to test how to improve the environment, so it was a bit of a catch-22, but yeah, we run into those problems.
As the anthropologist, I feel like I should briefly mention that this conversation seems to be focusing mostly on dogs in the industrialized West who would potentially be under the purview of regulations and the kinds of mechanisms that we've been discussing. The vast majority of dogs in this world, however, live very different lifestyles. Even than the rescue dogs or the dogs that we're most concerned about here. And so, in terms of helping animal welfare and the dogs in these other places, just basic veterinary care. I have colleagues at UC Davis. They've started an organization called International Veterinary Outreach, right? And so they take vet students and they go down and they just administer basic immunizations and fix these dogs reproductively and just basic things that we take for granted. And I know it costs money, right? It's but maybe not a whole lot of money. And you have investing in those sorts of organizations has potentially profound impacts, on a grand scale for a fairly small investment.
Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, I was going to reiterate that my wife does research on a endangered species of bird, a crow, in a very small island in Micronesia. Has 2 small villages there, and the dogs really are there for hunting, and there's boony dogs, which are the dogs, the feral dogs out in the jungle, and cats as well. And of course, all these are impacting wildlife issues. And there's no veterinarian on the island. They didn't have any opposition to spay and neuter, really, at all. They just didn't have a veterinarian ever on the island. One had passed through 5 years ago on a federal program or something like that. So we set up a program, and when we went to our comparative medicine veterinarian through a big university, we have a big comparative medicine department, and we said, and went to a donor and said, a few $1,000s for plane tickets, and then we need vets or vet techs to do the spay and neuter. A week on a beautiful tropical island in Micronesia, all expenses paid. We can't really cover your salary. Boom. We had a list of people who were, interested in coming over and doing large numbers of these. And it had a tremendous impact on the island and the cultural appreciation that we, big University of Washington from the mainland, had reached out to give them something, which helped our birds and all kinds of other. It was so there are a lot of ways that it can be done. Relatively small investment, really, using volunteers and things like that.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier today the Michelson Prize and grants, and one of the goals of that program, this development of a non-surgical method of sterilization, really is to make it easier to move into areas where they're really not going to put together the infrastructure to do high-volume spay-neuter programs. You're just never going to have that kind of package. And the ability, basically go down there with a cooler and a box of syringes and be able to sterilize a number of dogs relatively quickly. And we've actually, the ASPCA, through a group called the Alliance for Contraception in Cats and Dogs, have been involved in supporting a couple of test projects. Sterilizing one project with Veterinarians Without Borders actually occurred down in Paraguay, and they were attempting to look at this question of, and there it's one of those interesting pieces because it requires working with the community as well. I think the idea of almost needing an anthropological position or approach or the vision, because you're coming into a community and you want them to potentially change the way they've been interacting with their dogs for, hundreds of years. You're going to tell them that, we're from America. We know what's good for you and your dogs. Trust us. And, and so for people who've been used, as Kathryn was saying, people who are used to the fact that, hey, our dogs live a couple of years, the better ones live a little bit longer. Hey, puppies die, our kids die too. So it's a part of a different approach to life than we have. So we really need to go down there, and in many cases, it often requires developing an initial contact with somebody who, a community leader, a tribal leader who's ready to say, you know what, we do like our dogs, we'd like a little bit better for them. The other time that's interesting is the fact that in the Paraguay thing, one of the concerns was free-roaming dogs are actually attacking the sheep that they were trying to care for. And that was a valuable economic commodity. So they were really looking for something that would help to reduce the number of dogs there in the community. So sometimes you can use, that angle to get in to try and help the dogs.
I'll move on to another question that's come from our audience. Just a reminder, if all the speakers can please hold your microphone right up close to your faces. Thank you. Now, this has come partly from Wayne, and I'm going to add an observation to help you all see how you can contribute to the question that he's asked. He wants to know, Jeremy, if you can start your response here, whether owning dogs adds to social status within a culture. And I guess what I would like to ask you to consider in the context of dogs around the world, everybody, dogs are bred for their looks in the current Western world. Is that their modern job? Is that what they are to those societies that are breeding with an emphasis on looks, as compared to perhaps a dog that is being bred to be a tool or as part of a community? So if you can all consider that, and whether dogs add to the social status within a culture.
Okay, it sounds like there's 3 questions, and I'll try to remember them all. But first of all, is a Mayangna hunter in Nicaragua, does he gain social status if he has a talented dog? No, not directly. If anything, by virtue of having a talented dog, he's able to harvest more meat, and maybe he gains status by giving that away throughout the community. So there's potentially indirect benefits, but it's not like he gets credit for cultivating a prized yam, or there's no sense that he's really responsible for the dog's skills. Remember I mentioned in my talk, it's kind of an essentialist perspective, right? That either a dog is good or bad, and you win the lottery sometimes and you get a good one. As for the question of looks, I will say that the Mayangna and the Mosquito are very attuned to the looks of the dog. They give names that are largely based on, Spot, that kind of thing. Or Canela is a name that captures, the appearance of the dog. But they don't breed dogs at all, right? And so there's no sense of, they're happy to have a cute dog, but there's no sense of we're going to try to breed these dogs to look a certain way. Nor, frankly, do they try to breed for hunting ability. The females in heat are free to roam around the community, and whatever happens, happens, and maybe you get lucky.
Thank you. Hal?
Yeah, this is a good example of the differences in cultures, because in some cultures, dogs did convey social status. And so, for example, in ancient China, Pekingese was the lion dog, and that was restricted to royalty. You can go back, if you go through the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and you go back to the British paintings been beginning in the 17th and 18th century. What you see is these aristocrats with dogs. And the kennel clubs were originally started by the wealthy. And at that point, they did begin to breed for social status. Now, on the other hand, when they had, take China, when they had the Cultural Revolution, one of the things that they did was that they banned dog ownership. And so there was a mass slaughter of dogs because Chairman Mao saw that pets generally, especially dogs, were sort of a symbol of the upper classes. And so in some cultures, there has been this association of dogs with wealth.
Yeah, I guess when I was hearing you speak earlier today, Jeremy, and you were talking about this question of the dogs being bred out alone, I mean, one of the essential parts of the dog domestication mythology is that at one point, wolves tamed themselves, and then we started selecting the ones we liked. And if studying some of these other hunter-gatherer communities is supposed to be potentially a model of what our early relationships with dogs are all about, it's kind of interesting that, there hasn't been that step of saying, okay, you've got a great dog, I've got a great dog, let's put them together. I mean, at some point, that needs to happen in the dog evolution, and it's kind of interesting. And I'm not sure if you've seen it in, whether you've studied it or in the literature, that this, at least the beginnings of that has happened.
So to some extent, that's what our current project is about. We had read the Coppinger's book, and Ray Coppinger, whom many of you might be familiar with, had suggested that in these rural areas, just by virtue of the talented hunting dogs receiving better care, that they would survive better. And so you just end up with sort of selection for hunting ability as a trait, unconsciously, just because people are taking better care of the good hunting dogs. That said, I'm a little skeptical about that hypothesis for a few reasons. A, it certainly seems like all of these dogs are absolute mutts. And then B, there is a downside to being a good hunting dog, right? And that's that you get, instead of lounging around underneath the porch all day, potentially getting lucky reproductively, you're trotted out to the forest to nose into trunks with peccaries and jaguars and snakes, right? And so I don't know that necessarily good hunting ability is going to result in the mechanisms that Ray had suggested.
I have to speak up, so. I would just say that, so there's potentially another step there where you have, if you're originally in this environment of the dump site and your environment is full and you have those juveniles walking around that don't have enough food. Well, if you pair up with a person, so you basically adopt a person and you're closer to the food source, then that could potentially be an advantage. And once you're near someone, the idea was then you'd follow them off and do whatever they do, whether it was standing in the field and maybe you bark and that was kind of helpful, or maybe you walk around with the hunter and, show some helpfulness there eventually. But you wouldn't have to select directly for the best hunters. The idea would be instead that the next step would be that once you had a bunch of dogs, that after they reproduced, it wouldn't be pre-zygotic selection. So you wouldn't be saying this dog's good at hunting and this dog's good at hunting and we're going to breed them together. But, oh, look, this dog happens to be good at hunting. And then you use that dog for hunting, if that makes any sense.
I think so.
Keep it going.
Oh, we've got more questions. There's
Well,
no shortage
he's
of
gonna keep
questions.
it
I mean,
Yeah.
on that note, right, so the question that Steve was relating more so was asking about intentionality, right? I think, the whole history of breeding dogs, over the last few hundred years has focused on this idea of pre-zygotic selection, that we have an idea of what we want our dogs to look like, this particular breed. And the Mayang and the Mosquito with whom I work, they have some understanding of how breeding works. They know that they should be pairing their good hunting dogs together. They've picked that up from the scientists, but they don't do it, right? And why they don't have that motivation, it's not clear. And I don't know what you'd say about that.
I couldn't say why they don't have that motivation. I wouldn't. It doesn't really surprise me though. I wouldn't really expect them to do pre-zygotic selection. I mean, that's a lot more. It's a lot more effort. You have to keep them separated. You'd have to, exert some kind of keep them in cages, and it's hard to keep dogs from breeding when they do it a lot. So it would be a whole nother level of energy, right, to do that. When you just leave the population alone, you get some good dogs, like you said, and in fact. They don't seem to put a lot of energy into the training and all of that. So why put energy into breeding the best ones? It wouldn't surprise me very much, I guess, is what I'd say.
But I guess what's interesting related to that historically is, we knew by the time of the Egyptians, there were already specific types of dogs. And so obviously somebody before that had some intention, and they certainly didn't have Zeke kennels, right, or X-pens. So somehow or another they were able to do that, and clearly they had already been, breeding for faster horses and stuff like that in some ways. So I guess that question is, in some ways, where is that step between the, Ray Coppinger, the dogs in the dump, they kind of, they go from wolves to being dogs, and then somehow or another, we make the step from 35-pound yellow dog with prick ears and tail that curls over the back, that somebody sees something else. And I'm kind of curious whether, we don't have anything in the historical record. It seems like there, maybe it's one of those, pulses of evolution, that there's a step there that we just haven't found yet.
But again, post-zygotic selection would be, I think you're right. I think there is a question mark there. I think we don't know exactly what happened, and it is a big question mark. But I think that there is another step there, which would be post-zygotic selection. And we still see it today in a lot of the dogs that we consider breeds, but we're really, land races, so the guarding dogs and such. And what is happening there, and the reason those dogs all look similar, isn't because they're breeding animals together, but it's because those are the dogs that can make it on these long treks. And then somebody goes, hey, I like the dog with the white coat. I'm going to keep it a little closer, and it makes it a little better. And so now all the dogs have white coats. Or maybe they cull some dogs, right? They cull all the black dogs. They don't like that color. And then we, of course, make up fun reasons why they're white when they become AKC breeds. You go, oh, they blend in with the sheep or whatever. But it was just some guy being like, I like this white dog. I'm going to keep it a little closer, or I'm going to kill all the other ones. So you wouldn't have to have this breeding that we think of to get a type of dog.
Actually, the comment about how those standards get set and the dog, he's white so he can blend in with the sheep. One of my favorite ones is always this idea that bloodhounds and basset hounds have long ears to sweep the scent up. I've heard that one, and I've never seen any empirical evidence for it. I spent, a zillion hours following dogs in the field. I just don't think it's true.
All right, we've got another question that's come from someone in the audience, and perhaps, Kathryn, if you can start with it. We're kind of actually slightly combining two great questions that have come through. So one is for you all to consider, what are the basic properties of a dog, and how and should we, or how can and should we bring this into our relationships with them? So that's part one of the question. But then also, given what you know about humans and dogs and their evolution, where do you see our relationship with dogs going over the next 100 years?
Those are two really big
parts
questions.
What we should apply about what we know about the basic properties of dogs, and parts looking forwards to where we're heading.
Okay. So, I think we still have a lot of things we need to learn about the basic properties of dogs, but some things where we run into a lot of problems that we're starting to understand better are things like, do they have dominance hierarchies and things like that? That kind of mythology of the, are they like their wild ancestors or are they not? So we can learn a lot about those basic properties by looking at these dogs in these different systems and pet systems, right? There's so many things. The basic size and shape of the dog, the behavior of scavenging. So they are no longer being these hunters that have to go through complex cooperative hunting, in some cases in the wolf, or in some of the smaller canids, it's a little simpler, canis, I should say. But they don't need that. It's not that all those behaviors have disappeared. We certainly, as we see in dogs that we have selected later, or in the dogs that Jeremy studies, it can still be brought out, but it's not necessary for survival. And I think we see a lot of that in dogs. We have a lot of these remnants of pieces of behaviors from their wild ancestors that can show back up or be selected for, but they aren't an integral part of their surviving abilities. So they're no longer integral to their behavior. But then we can pull them back out, or they can show back up when we throw them in different environments, and I think that leads to a lot of misunderstandings, because we say, aha, that looks just like a wolf, or that looks just like, and we assume that it's the same thing, and it's not. And moving forward, I think, there's the pessimistic view and the optimistic view. The pessimistic view is that we keep on the same track that we're on and dogs are like fashion statements, as has been brought up, or that we are continuing this really harsh inbreeding and things just go downhill fast and we keep getting more and more behavior problems and more trouble with human-animal relationships, or we turn it around and we say there's a problem here, we're not doing a good job with our pet animals. I don't think we're necessarily doing a really good job with the dogs that are out there in their original habitat either. We think we misunderstand them a lot as well. And so trying to get more information and sort of turn this trajectory around a little bit. Very broad, but.
Can we ask you to chime in, Hal?
Yeah, one of my students and I did a study recently, and we asked people to, we were interested in an interesting but odd question is, how much can we screw around with an animal and it loses naturalness? So how less natural is a elephant in a zoo compared to an elephant on the savannah? And one of the animals we asked about was dogs. And so how much does a wolf lose in naturalness by being domesticated? Well, we found when it came to being domesticated, they lost about 25% of their perceived naturalness. Where they lost a ton of naturalness was in cloning. And so a cloned dog, we lost about 90% of its perceived naturalness. Is this making sense at all? You're looking at me like this is crazy weird, which it sort of was. And so I see 100 years is a long time. And so it seems to me that we had this tension going on. In 100 years, they're starting to clone, Steve and I were talking about the other day, they're cloning now rodeo bucking broncos for the rodeo. So my guess is in 100 years, we're going to see cloned dogs. And so what's going to happen is it's going to be a substantial change in this relationship because we've taken an animal that is sort of a natural animal, especially mutts, as opposed to, let's say, a Bichon Frise or something like that. But once you add the genetic technology in there, that makes it different. Does that make sense?
Unnatural? So are you talking about everyone's going to have a teacup cloned pug, like it's going to be the most unnatural?
I'm saying that's possible.
Yeah,
that could be the case.
Wow.
And we're talking. You asked what it's going to be like 100 years, and I'm saying in 100 years our relationships with dogs could be completely different. Another possibility is that if we keep considering dogs as literally people too, more and more the logical extension of that is it's immoral to keep them as pets. And it's also possible, I could think, in 100 years, where pet keeping is something which is seen as being not very morally desirable.
I think, when I look at it, I think it's a question of not the future. There's an opportunity for futures, and we're probably at some inflection points. I've talked to Hal the other day about, the question of this growth, in the whole rescue dog question. If you look at the absolute data, purebred dogs represent 60 to 65% of the dogs in this country, at least what people report. And that hasn't changed. And in fact, the number of purebred dogs has gone up in the last decade because the number of dogs has gone up. So even though registrations have gone down, somehow or another people are thinking about this differently. One of the odd things to think about if you're a population geneticist or an evolutionary biologist is, at least in this country, somewhere between 70 to 85% of the dogs are sterilized. So we're really looking at a relatively limited part of the overall dog population that can actually continue to contribute to the next generation. We look at something like, and we've talked about this in the field at times, if we look at something like pit bulls, which are a politically hot topic, ironically, probably most of the nicest pit bulls in America are unable to contribute their genes to a next generation because, the people who have really nice ones and take good care of them and make sure they're socialized are responsible pet owners, and they've had them sterilized. Alternatively, the people who are breeding dogs, hey, I don't really care if he's terribly aggressive, if he's uncontrollable, highly reactive. I'll breed him, because I can sell the puppies. So I think that's one of the odd things. That's one of those, if you, as I say, if you look into this opportunity for different futures, that's one of the pathways that doesn't look really helpful. And I think, one of the other questions is, as Hal said, do we start questioning, having pets? And from another end, as we continue to humanize them, we are creating a point where sometimes the question of how much we invest in the animals is going to become difficult to contemplate. I was told people, 15, 20 years ago, if your dog was sick and you went into the veterinarian and said, do whatever you can to save him. Well, the vet could run every test they had, every procedure they had, and you'd get a $2,000 bill. Right now, you walk in with something other than upper respiratory infection or an ear infection, you might start with a $2,000 bill, and it cranks pretty quickly from there. And now when you're talking about, wow, caring for my dog, that's a couple of months mortgage payment. It's my kid's college money. So we're reaching a point where now it's almost difficult for people to make the decision they used to make at one time, saying, I can't afford to care for my pet anymore. He is sick. Would you euthanize him? And, that's another future that's strange to look at.
I'd like to mention just another issue, and it's again typical for the Western industrial societies. Okay, just give me just one example. Why do you like a dog? Just one thing. Why do you like your dog? Because he is... Just tell me.
My cat?
Your dog.
I don't have a dog.
You don't have a dog? I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Why do you like your dog? Oh, no. Okay. Okay. Just one thing.
I lost my dog a year ago.
Okay. Let's
Canine
let's
scientists doing secret.
rephrase the question in the past tense. Okay. What was the?
I don't know.
He was a friend.
Okay. Ooh. Okay, Kathleen. Tell me you have a dog. But you loved him, haven't you? Okay, just tell me one. Okay, why do you love your dog? Please.
We're going to bit of audience participation.
Can anybody out there keep a dog alive?
Where are you, dog owners? Okay, because you're loyal, it's gentle, it's friendly. Tell me just.
Companion, member of the family.
Okay,
Yeah.
and ask a breeder, why has he or she chosen a given male, a given stud for her or his female dog to breed with? They would never mention these features. Mm-hmm. They would mention, okay, the stud won at Westminster or anywhere else. What about the ears and tails and everything? So that's nonsense. And we buy our dogs from these breeders because we want a friend. But they don't breed. There are no selection for social abilities, for cognitive abilities, just backline and tail and ears. So I think that's a problem.
Can I say something about that? I hung around dog shows sometimes, and a dog handler, professional dog handler, handled silky terriers, and she sort of took me under her wing for a couple of days. And I asked her, I said, Barbara, how much would it cost for me to buy like a really good puppy? And she said, show quality puppy. She said, probably $3,000 or $4,000. And then I said, well, what if? But then she said, oh, but I could sell you a pet quality dog for about $600. And that's when I realized to these breeders, pet quality means loser. And they're exactly right. They're not breeding the types of dogs that people want. They're breeding the dogs that fits this sort of platonic, whacked out platonic standard, the ideal that they have in their heads.
Or just add.
But the real problem is that the pet quality is not that it's social, it's friendly, it's that it's not good for breeding purposes for some
I would
reason.
add that it's not just the breeder's fault, though, of course, and I agree with you that that happens, but when people are picking a dog, it's also not behavioral, whether it's through the breeder or through the shelter. It's often with the way they look. I want the dog that's the darkest. I want the dog that has this spot on its forehead. I want the dog, and sure, they go up and they'll meet it, but that often isn't why people, it's black, I don't want it. It's a big black dog, forget it. So that also is on the side of the pet owners oftentimes.
So it seems like this could be an area for more research in terms of the physical qualities. Who knows, maybe if people spend more on their good-looking dog that they consider, do they take better care of it? You know, I don't know. So these are lots of questions we could ask if we had funding, right? We can ask them anyway, but it would be nice. Did you want to carry on?
I can ask one more question, yeah.
Awesome.
One more question, I think, before we have to end our live broadcast, and then we will continue here in Phoenix. But the questions come through a few different channels. It's in regards to rescuing wild dogs. So we've seen a history recently, say prior to the last Olympic Games, where there was a cleaning up of free roaming living dogs who seemed to be living free roaming lives. And rescuing them into shelters where they're held in then captivity and rehomed and adopted into people's homes. And just to discuss that as an issue related to dogs around the world. And it ties in a little bit with what you said, I guess, about perhaps Western societies imposing their values, but also that perception that they need to be tidied up, and this is the best way to tidy them up. So, Kathryn, do you want to start? You've got your hand on the mic.
Sure. Sure. So I would say, well, Ray always is fond of saying that the worst thing that can happen to a free living dog is for it to be adopted. But I think that has a lot of validity. So first of all, if you think about where that animal is raised, it's socialized to a level that it's kind of like a pigeon in the park, right? So it can get a certain distance away, and it might take food from a person, but it's not going to come up. And anybody who's worked with these dogs that got brought into the shelter, they see this, right? You can hold the food out, and they lean out as far as they can, and they grab the food and they run away. So it's not a comfortable situation for them to be in the first place. And I think a lot of it comes from the idea that these were pet animals that have strayed. And when you realize that that's not the case, suddenly that pressure is relieved, and it's as if you said, oh, look at all the poor coyotes out there. We should bring them into our homes. I mean, of course we're not going to do that. They're a population of animals. We might be concerned if they all disappeared, but we're not going to adopt them because it would be a bad idea. And I had another point and I forgot it, so I'm going to give it to another person and maybe it'll come back.
It's interesting she says that because as the graphs that I showed earlier today, these changing numbers in shelters, and particularly in the Northeast, I mean, the odd thing, I remember getting into the field and people used to say, boy, we're the only business that wants to put ourselves out of business. And now as some of the numbers have come down, we've had shelter directors say, damn, if we don't get some dogs, we ain't gonna have nothing, we won't have any, we're gonna have to close up. And so they're bringing dogs in from elsewhere. And some of these places up in the Northeast, in the New York City metropolitan area, they're bringing up the Sato dogs from Puerto Rico, the street dogs. And my name's out there, and I get the telephone call from somebody who adopted one of these dogs, and I have to tell them, you've adopted a feral dog. I mean, this is not the dog who's going to come and sit next to you when you're watching television. The dog is going to hide behind the couch. They'll come out and eat. You're not going to be he's not going to like to bring in a lot of guests or anything like that. And will it become better? Yeah, over a really long period of time, potentially, you're going to need I said, you've adopted the equivalent of a coyote, and maybe less.
Can I just, one contribution to maybe help Jeremy and Hal come into the conversation as well. From my understanding, some of these communities where these shelters have been set up don't have a history of adopting animals at all. So the whole concept is very foreign to sort of kickstart within a culture. And also, my other thought was that the irony that some people are spending huge amounts of money to help relocate one of these dogs into their home when their own shelter down the road has got many animals looking for a home. Some animals looking for a home, depending on where you are.
I remembered my other point. Yeah. It was that, And in many countries where they have a large excess of free-roaming dogs, and this can be a big problem, they have disease, they'll breed occasionally with endangered species. It happens a lot, actually, because they don't have any of their own species to breed with. They also harbor disease for those endangered species. We heard about some dogs killing livestock, things like that. So they can be problematic, and so they want to deal with them. And because of pressure from the countries that are heavily pet-owning countries not to cull them, they have to think of some other options. So sometimes we see them putting them permanently in kennels, which, I mean, that isn't, welfare-wise, that isn't a better option than humanely culling animals. Sticking a bunch of free-living dogs in a kennel for the rest of their lives is, I think we could agree, it's a pretty cruel thing to do. So I think we have to also consider that we're imposing some values on them that they then have to deal with. And I would say probably the easiest way to get rid of dogs, though, is to get rid of the garbage. And then if they don't have a niche, they don't have a place to live, so.
Jeremy, is there anything you'd like to contribute about, I guess, that cultural aspect of why we want to help a dog that's a million miles away rather than the one in our suburb, versus also just that difference, or why people want to set up a system perhaps in a place that isn't able to sustain it afterwards? Or not.
I am a little hesitant to go there because, frankly, there is good intentions behind a lot of these efforts, and these programs can fail for a lot of reasons, as can other kinds of development programs, right? And yes, I'll make a pitch for good social science to get in there preliminarily and figure out what is going to work and what's not. On the one hand, I am a little skeptical about some of the programs that Kathryn alludes to, right, in terms of, finding homes for all of these dogs. But I don't want to be so pessimistic that to A, recognizing that it is a major problem for the disease, for the other issues, and B, I don't want people to be dissuaded from continuing to find solutions to these very big problems.
Can I ask Jeremy a question?
Yeah.
Yeah. If you work in the shelter world, there's always the point where your dog, you're in and out all the time. Eventually, you take one home. The question I'm going to ask you is, has any of these dogs caught your eye and you'd say, I'd like to put that one with me and I'll take that one home?
So, not me personally, but you saw that long list of names at the end of my slide, right? And lots of people that come into the field with me, and they develop a fondness for a particular dog. Goodness, the veterinarians, sometimes I would get so frustrated with them because, I'm a quantitative researcher. I know we need a certain sample size, and they take 10, 15 minutes because a puppy's so cute, and they just can't work until they've cuddled the heck out of it, right? So yeah, I think that, there is that immediate sort of attraction that brings some people to want to bring them home. They tease me. They say, they tease me. They're like, it's just a number in a spreadsheet for you, and maybe there's an ounce of truth to that. But I will say, okay, I went into the forest lots and lots of times with hunters and their dogs, and I wouldn't say I necessarily developed the kind of affection where I'd want to adopt the dog, but goodness, I developed a profound respect for what some of these dogs were able to do. And as somebody who has not owned a dog since I was a toddler, right? This was my first opportunity to walk side by side with a dog on a regular basis. And what these dogs were able to do, running through the forest, even as the thorns in the forest are scraping up their ears, right? And they just keep on running. It was life-changing to develop that kind of respect for what these dogs are doing.
We need to wrap things up for the live broadcast now. So thank you to all of our speakers and your contributions for today, considering dogs around the world in so many different ways. We look forward to a fresh day tomorrow. and one that will be just 1 day's worth of schedule in 1 day, rather than today, evacuations pending. So if everyone can join us in thanking today's speakers, and we'll say goodbye to the rest of the world.